In the summer of 1893, every spring in Cane Bottom went silent except one. For 4 years the Hollow had laughed at the gaunt man who dug a ditch from a high creek to his fields, and named it the Fool's Folly. By July the rains had quit, the wells were mud, and the corn was curling. The only water still moving in the valley ran through that ditch, and the men who mocked it were coming to ask for it. The story came down the generations the way mountain stories do, turning on the man everyone dismissed, and the summer that left him holding the only water. Cane Bottom sat in a fold of the western Carolina mountains, where the ridges lean close and the sun arrives late, a narrow strip of bottomland threaded by a creek the families called Stony Fork. A dozen kin-connected households worked that ground in the late 1880s, raising corn and winter greens, keeping hogs and a milk cow, mending fence through the short days of winter. There were no paved roads and no wires strung along the ridges. The trails out of the hollow turned to cold soup the moment the rains held on a few days too long, and you either knew the people 2 farms over or you didn't survive a hard season there, because survival in a place like that was a thing you did together or not at all. The hollow had the shape of a hand, the old men liked to say, with the ridges for fingers and the bottomland for the palm, and the houses sat where the fingers met the palm because that was where the water was. The water decided where they lived. Each home had been built within a short carry of a spring, since every drop a family used had to be moved by hand. A man measured his good fortune by how short that walk was from the door to the water and back. Where the slope helped, a family ran a wooden trough from the spring straight to the yard, or even into the kitchen, and let gravity do the hauling that their backs would otherwise have done. And that small cleverness was the thing that separated a comfortable household from a tired one. The grist mill at the lower end of the hollow worked on the same principle, and it was the one piece of shared industry Cane Bottom had. A chute brought water down from Stony Fork to turn the stone, and the stone ground everyone's corn, and the miller kept a share for the work. When the creek ran strong, the mill ran strong, and when the creek ran thin, the mill ran thin. And there were weeks in late summer when a man waited 2 days for his corn because the water was too low to turn the wheel. Nobody complained about it. Complaining about the creek was like complaining about the weather, but everyone understood that the whole hollow hung off that water. Water in those years wasn't a thing anyone paid for or thought much about, because it had never been a thing anyone had to. Folks believed that spring water coming down off the steep mountain hollers was the only water fit to drink, and they had little patience for anything else. The springs had always given them enough to be patient about. A spring house held the milk and the butter through the warm months, set in the cold water that came up out of the rock, and that was as close to refrigeration as anyone in Cane Bottom got. And the water was simply there the way the timber and the rock were there. The years before the trouble had been kind ones, and the kindness is worth dwelling on because it explains the laughter that came later. Nothing had gone wrong for a long time. Rain came when it was expected, the creeks ran steady through August, and the bottomland produced without anyone having to beg it, season after season, until the plenty began to feel like a promise. That stretch of good weather bred a quiet confidence, the kind that settles into a place when nothing has gone wrong for long enough. Men who had grown up watching their fathers wait on the sky began to talk as if the sky could be trusted to keep its word, and the people who remembered harder decades were dying off. Tucked into that confidence was one man who didn't share it, and the hollow would spend years not understanding why. His strange habits were the first sign. Amos Callaway worked a 40-acre bottom at the upper end of the hollow, alone since his wife passed, and the neighbors knew him mostly by his silence and his strange habits. He was a gaunt man in his middle 50s, weathered crooked by years of work. His was the kind of leathery skin that comes from a life spent outdoors in every season and no season for giving, and people left him alone, mostly, the way you leave alone a man who isn't hurting anyone but isn't quite doing things the way everyone else does. And that leaving alone was about to become the most expensive courtesy the hollow ever extended. The strange habits were the thing people remembered when they told the story later, because they were the first sign that Amos was reading a different book than the rest of the hollow. He would walk the ridge above his bottomland in weather that kept other men indoors, picking his way along the north slope where the timber held the shade, watching something the rest of the hollow couldn't see and didn't think to look for. A stick and a length of string were all he carried. He would crouch at the head of Raven Branch, the little creek that came off the high ridge, and study the way the water moved over the stones as if it were a letter written to him alone, though to a man passing on the trail below, it looked like nothing at all. The pastime of a man with too much time and not enough company. What Amos had noticed, across many seasons of watching, was that the high spring feeding Raven Branch never went dry. The mountain seemed to be saving it, not in the short dry spells that turned every other trickle in the hollow to dust, and not in the late summers when the creek at the bottom shrank to a whisper that could barely turn the mill. The north slope held the snow longer than any face of the ridge, and the timber kept the ground cool through the hottest weeks, and the water came up out of the rock there, as if the mountain had decided to store it against a day it knew was coming. He had watched it through enough dry stretches to trust it, the way a man trusts a thing he has tested with his own eyes over years. His wife had been the only one who understood what he was doing, and she was gone now, and the understanding had gone with her into the ground. They had talked about the water in the evenings, the way a couple talks over the work of a farm, and she had been the one to say that a man who could see a dry year coming had an obligation to do something about it before it arrived. After she passed, the talking stopped, but the watching didn't. The watching slowly became planning, and the planning slowly became a project so large it would eat the next 4 years of his life. Because a man alone doesn't need anyone's permission to commit his years to a ditch. The idea took hold slowly, the way ideas do in a taciturn man who doesn't talk them out loud. Gravity could do what the rain would not. If a person could move that high water down along the contour of the hill, bring it to the bottomland by gravity alone, his fields would never have to wait on the rain. It wasn't a new thought in the wider world, where men had been digging ditches to move water onto their ground since before anyone could remember. And across the country, farmers were cutting channels with teams and walking plows to do exactly that. But nobody in Cane Bottom had ever tried it, because nobody had ever needed to. And that was the whole trouble with the idea, because the need hadn't arrived yet, and the man who saw it coming couldn't make anyone else see it. A man doesn't spend years of his life on a ditch without a reason he can feel in his bones. And Amos's reason was older than the ditch by decades. The promise he made himself was old. There's a kind of silence that falls over a hollow when the water gives out. He had heard it once before, in his youth, when a dry year took the bottomland corn and a kinsman lost his stock, and the hollow carried water from 2 ridges over until even that spring failed, and the memory of it sat in him like a stone, and wouldn't let him alone. He had decided, somewhere in those quiet years after his wife, that he wouldn't watch water fail his ground again, not if his own hands could do anything about it, and his hands were still good. So he began to plan the way a taciturn man plans, alone and in pieces, walking the line from Raven Branch down to his fields 100 times through every season. The line lived in his head first. He was eyeing the fall of the ground, figuring how steep to cut the grade so the water would move without rushing, because a ditch too steep would scour itself out in a season, and one too flat would pool and stall, and either way the work would be wasted. His only instruments were his eye, a length of string, and the old teamster's trick of measuring distance by the turns of a wagon wheel. He also had the patience of a man who had already decided the job would take years, and had made his peace with that, and by the winter of 1887 he had the line in his head, and by the spring of 1888 he had the mule and the plow, and the first day's work ahead of him. The work began in the spring of 1888, and it didn't end until the fall of 1892. And the length of it is the first thing to understand about the mockery that followed. Progress was measured in feet. Amos started at the take point on Raven Branch, where he built a headgate of split oak to control the flow, fitting the timbers by hand and packing the seams with clay so the water wouldn't simply bleed away into the hill the moment he turned it loose. From there he cut a shallow trench along the contour of the ridge, working mostly alone with a mule and a walking plow, turning the sod a furrow at a time and breaking the ground for the ditch that would follow. The first week he moved 40 feet, and the second week he moved less, and a man who measures his progress in feet has to be ready to measure his life in seasons. The going was slow, and it was harder than anyone watching from below could have guessed, because the ridge didn't give up its ground easily. Rock was the worst of it. Where the soil was loose the plow did the work, but where the ground was solid rock, he had to break it with a bar and a sledge. A foot of progress for a day's sweat, and there were stretches where the rock ran along the line for rods, and the ditch advanced at the pace of a man beating a mountain with iron. There were also stretches where the trench wouldn't hold water unless he lined it with flat stones laid tight and sealed with clay, and that meant prying the stones out of the hillside and carrying them to the line and fitting them by hand, one by one, like a man building a dry creek bed from nothing. The ditch wasn't a single kind of labor, but 6 kinds, and each kind had to be done in its own season and its own weather. He graded the fall by eye, and by the old teamster's trick he had carried in his head, tying a rag to a spoke of his mule cart's wheel and counting the turns to measure the distance along the line. The work was meant to outlast him. The trick was to keep the drop gentle, about an inch for every 20 feet, so the water would walk down the hill instead of running, because running water cuts and walking water carries, and a ditch that lets the water run will dig its own grave in a season. He checked the grade by setting a level on the plow beam, the way the ditch men in the wider country did it, and where the ground fell too fast he built little stone drops to slow the water, and where it fell too slow he deepened the cut to keep it moving. Nobody in Cane Bottom had any reason to notice that kind of detail, and it was the kind of detail that would make the whole thing work. It was the kind of labor that swallows a man whole, and the first summer it swallowed Amos whole and didn't give him back until the cold. Through the mornings, when the fog sat in the timber, he was on the line, and through the afternoons, when the heat rose off the south slopes, he was on the line, and the only sounds were the mule and the plow and the scrape of the blade and the crows that followed him looking for grubs. He ate his dinner sitting in the ditch he had cut. He worked until the light went, and then he went home and did the chores and slept and came back, and the ditch crept along the side of the ridge like a slow wound that wouldn't close, and by the second summer he was still only halfway to the bottomland he meant to water. People in the hollow had begun to notice by the second year, and what they noticed didn't make sense to them, because nothing in their experience explained it. Amusement slowly turned to something harder. A man spending his best years on a ditch to bring water to land that already got rain looked, to anyone with sense, like a man who had lost his, and the longer the work went on the less sense it made to the people watching it from below. The first reactions were amusement, the head-shaking kind you give a neighbor who has taken up a strange hobby, and then slowly something harder, as the ditch grew and the joke didn't end and the man showed no sign of stopping. A joke that goes on for 2 years stops being a joke and starts being a worry, and a joke that goes on for 4 years starts being a name. The ditch got its name the way things do in a small place, by being repeated until it sticks, and once it stuck it never came loose. The name followed him everywhere. They called it the Fool's Ditch, and they called it Amos's Folly, and the names traveled from the country store to the brush arbor meetings, to the kitchens where the women pumped water and wondered out loud what had gotten into him. Amos didn't explain himself, and he didn't argue, and that made it worse, because the silence that a taciturn man uses to protect his pride reads in a close mountain community as either stubbornness or madness. He kept grading the fall and laying the stone and packing the clay, and the ditch kept growing, one furrow at a time, toward a bottomland that didn't yet know it needed it and a hollow that didn't yet know it would owe him everything. By the fall of 1892 the ditch was finished, or finished enough to run, and the first water came down the line on a cold evening with no one there to see it. Water from Raven Branch walked the gentle grade Amos had spent 4 years cutting, along the stone he had laid and the clay he had packed, and it reached the bottomland and spread out across the low end of his fields like a slow tide. He stood at the spill and watched it fill the furrows. There was no crowd there, only the mule and the evening and the sound the water made moving over ground that had waited a long time, and the hollow noted that the ditch worked and then went back to not caring, because the rain was still coming, and a man doesn't thank the roof until the weather turns. The mocking had a ringleader, the way mocking often does, and the ringleader in Cane Bottom was a younger farmer named Harlan Sisk who had bottomland of his own down toward the lower end. Harlan made the store his stage. Harlan was a loud man with a loud opinion about everything, and he had the kind of confidence that comes from never having been wrong in a way that cost him, which is the most dangerous kind of confidence theirs. He made the Fool's Ditch his regular entertainment at the country store, telling the story of it to anyone passing through, how old Amos was digging a canal to water a field that the Lord already watered for free. The men around him laughed because it was easier to laugh than to think about it, and because Harlan was the kind of man whose jokes you laughed at if you wanted to keep the peace. A joke that the whole hollow shares is a powerful thing, and it doesn't need to be true to do its work. And the fool's ditch became the work it did. Truth was never part of the joke. Through the third year, the laughter became a kind of landmark, and people giving directions would say past the fool's ditch, meaning Amos's place, and the name followed him into the brush arbor meetings and the corn huskings and the long Sunday dinners on the grounds. Children were sent past his bottomland with a warning not to bother the strange man and his trench, and the warning taught them, the way warnings do, that there was something wrong with him worth being warned about. The ditch was never just a ditch after that, because a ditch with a name is a story, and a story a whole hollow tells about one man is a kind of cage. Kin began to quietly distance themselves, not from cruelty so much as from the old mountain instinct against being associated with anything that draws a crowd's contempt, and the instinct was older than anyone in the hollow could trace. Cruelty was not the point. A cousin who had helped Amos lay fence in years past stopped coming up the hollow, and a brother who lived over the ridge let his visits stretch to months apart. And the women who had sat with his wife before she died found reasons to be busy when he passed. The isolation didn't look like cruelty from the inside, because nobody did a single cruel thing, but from the outside it looked like a man being slowly set aside by the people around him for the crime of seeing something they couldn't see. Mountain people had learned, generation after generation, that standing out from your neighbors rarely ended well, and the learning was in the air the families breathed. Amos worked on, and the ditch crept closer to the bottomland, and the only people who watched without laughing were a few of the oldest men in the hollow, the ones who could remember a dry year the younger farmers had never seen. Their silence was the most they could give. They didn't say much, because saying much in a place like that was a good way to be grouped with the fool, but they watched Amos lay the stone and grade the fall, and they didn't join in the laughter when it started up around them. There's a kind of quiet sympathy that old men extend to a younger man who is doing a thing they half remember needing, and it doesn't cost them anything because they don't have to say it out loud. When the story was told later, those old men were the ones who said they hadn't laughed, and they were telling the truth, and it was about as much as anyone could have done. The story doesn't say whether Amos ever doubted what he was doing, because the story is the kind that gets told by people who admired the outcome and didn't have access to the inside of the man. Only the outcome survived in the telling. The way it was told later, he was a man who had made up his mind and didn't require company for it, and that kind of certainty is hard to argue with from the outside and impossible to help from the inside. He had seen a hollow go dry in his youth, and he had sworn to himself that he wouldn't watch it happen to his ground again, and the memory of that summer was more real to him than the laughter of the men around him. Whether that's wisdom or stubbornness depends entirely on whether the rain keeps falling, and in the fourth year of the ditch the rain was still falling, and the laughter was still easy, and neither one had any reason to stop. Vindication has a cruel requirement, which is that it needs the disaster to arrive, and in the summer the ditch was finished, the disaster was nowhere in sight. A proud man could not easily look at that. The rains came on time that year, and the bottomland produced without the ditch's help, and a man standing at the spill could watch his 4 years of work run water into ground that didn't need it, and that's a hard thing for a proud man to look at. What the hollow saw was a green field and an unnecessary ditch, and it concluded what any reasonable person would conclude, that Amos had wasted the best years of his life on a solution to a problem that didn't exist. The problem was coming, and it was closer than anyone knew, and the men who laughed the loudest were the men it would hurt the most. The weather turned in the spring of 1893, and the turning was so slow at first that the hollow talked itself out of worrying about it. At first, worry was easy to dismiss. Rain that the families had been counting on came late, and then came thin, and then didn't come at all. And by May the men were looking at the sky the way you look at a door that should have opened, and didn't. The corn went into the ground on time, because you plant on time whether the sky is cooperating or not. But the ground was already drier than anyone liked, and the creeks were lower than they should have been for the season. Nobody said the word drought out loud yet, because you don't say that word in a place like Cane Bottom until the land has made you say it. June made them say it. Springs that fed the kitchens began to whisper, and then to fail, and the families who had trusted their spring for a generation carried buckets from farther and farther up the hollow, looking for water that wasn't there. Stony Fork shrank to a muddy thread that a child could step across without wetting her knees, and the pools where the stock used to drink turned to cracked mud and the smell of dead algae, and the grist mill at the lower end slowed and then stopped for lack of water to turn the stone. The bottomland corn, which had come up green and promising, began to curl in the afternoons and not uncurl at night, and a corn plant that curls in the day and stays curled at night is a plant that has given up. What settled over the hollow wasn't a single disaster, but a long grinding absence, the kind of drought that doesn't break in one storm because no storm is coming, and that's the worst kind. No storm was coming to break it. The wet years that had made everyone confident had been a streak, and the streak was over, and the men who had laughed at the fool's ditch were watching their ground turn the color of a paper bag in the afternoons. Assurance that the land would always come through had been a comfort, not a promise, and now the comfort was gone and the promise had never existed, and there was nothing to do with that knowledge except carry water and wait and try not to look at the sky. The drought that gripped the country that year was bad enough that the journals of the time called it one that would take its place among the recorded events of history, and the people in the hollow didn't need a journal to tell them what they could see out their windows. It wasn't only Cane Bottom that was drying up, and knowing that didn't help and didn't hurt, because a drought that covers a country still has to be survived one hollow at a time. Cane Bottom was a small part of a larger ruin. Across the wider land the dry years had begun in the late 1880s and wouldn't fully break until 1896, and they had already ruined the men who tried to farm the high plains on rainfall alone, and they would help push the country toward a new law about water within a decade. The old belief that rain would follow the plow, that settling the land would somehow bring the rain with it, had been a comfortable story, and the drought was busy proving it was only a story, and the proof was being written in dead corn from one end of the country to the other. Cane Bottom was a small part of a much larger drying, but to the people in it, the much larger drying didn't matter, because the only drying that mattered was the one they could feel under their boots. Older men remembered, then, the dry years of their youth, and the remembering didn't do them any good because remembering doesn't make it rain, but it did give them one thing the younger men didn't have. Memory was the only advantage they had. They had seen a hollow go dry before, and they knew what came after the springs failed, and they knew that the worst of a drought isn't the day it starts, but the week it keeps going and the month after that. The younger men, who had never seen a season like it, handled it worse, because they had built their whole understanding of the hollow on the assumption that the water would always be there, and the assumption was breaking in front of them. Confidence is a thing you only discover was confidence when the thing you were confident about stops. And in the summer of 1893 it stopped for everyone in Cane Bottom at once. Laughter had gone out of the valley by then, and a quiet had come in to take its place, the heavy kind that sits over a place when people are calculating how bad it can get and don't like the answer. One man they had laughed at was still green. The Fool's Ditch, which the hollow had spent 4 years amusing itself with, was still running, and nobody had thought to mention it yet, because nobody wanted to think about what it meant. But the water in it was moving, and the water everywhere else wasn't, and the gap between those two facts was about to become the only thing that mattered in Cane Bottom. The rain had quit, the wells were mud, and the one man the hollow had set aside was the one man whose ground was still green, and the summer wasn't even half over. By July the drought had moved from worry to wreckage, and the wreckage moved through the hollow the way fire moves through a barn, room by room. Cane Bottom was coming apart. The last of the kitchen springs gave out, and the women who had carried water from them all their married lives stood at dry openings and tried to figure where the next bucket was coming from, and there was no good answer to that question. Livestock went without drink for stretches that would have sounded impossible a year earlier, and a man who lost a milk cow to thirst in those mountains lost something he couldn't easily replace, because a cow was a year's butter and a year's milk and a calf in the spring. The animals suffered first and most quietly, and the people who watched them suffer carried the weight of it in a way the story doesn't always make room for. Barrels were hauled by wagon from springs to ridges over, when a man was lucky enough to have a kinsman over there with water still, and the road out of the hollow was too rough to make that trip often. Every drop had to be fought for. A family would send its strongest boy with the mule and the barrels at first light and count itself fortunate to be back by dark with enough water for a day and a half, and the next morning the boy would go again. There were families who had no kinsman over the next ridge and no mule to spare, and for them the water came from wherever it could be found, a spring seep here, a mud puddle strained through cloth there, and the dignity of a household showed in ways it had never shown before. Women who had kept spring houses full of cold milk and butter were keeping nothing now, because there was no cold water to keep anything in. The bottomland was finished, and a finished bottomland is a harder thing to look at than an empty one because it shows you what you almost had. Everything they had stored was burning. Corn that had curled in June was standing dead in July, the leaves gray and rolled, the ears stunted to nothing, and a field of dead corn makes a particular sound in the wind that the people of Cane Bottom would remember for the rest of their lives. Gardens went the same way, the beans and the greens burning up in the afternoons, and the root crops that should have carried a family through the winter weren't going to carry anyone anywhere because there hadn't been the water to make them grow. The hollow had measured its wealth in jars and cribs and hay, and the drought was burning through all of it, one slow day at a time, and the days weren't slowing down. Scarcity does things to neighbors that abundance never does, and the hollow began to turn on itself in small, familiar ways that the older men had been dreading since the springs first whispered. The drought was teaching them what water was worth. Old fault lines about who had rights to which spring came back up, the kind of grievances that sit quiet for years and surface the moment water gets short, and a man would catch another man's stock standing in his last pool, and the argument that followed would carry to the next farm, and the next. Water trouble in those mountains had always been a serious thing, and the records of the dry years across the country are full of that seriousness turned to bitterness, headgates destroyed and ditches fought over, and water keepers sent to hold the peace with badges and guns. There was a saying from those years that a man could fool around with your wife, but not your water rights. And it wasn't entirely a joke, and the people in Cane Bottom would have understood it without explanation. You can feel the hollow tipping past thirst into something worse that week, because thirst is a problem, and a fight is a different kind of problem. The water was almost gone. There was one corner of the valley where it wasn't gone, a corner nobody had paid any attention to in years, and that corner was about to matter most for the people who had laughed hardest at it. Every source of water in the hollow went quiet that summer, except one, and the noticing of it happened the way noticing does, in pieces and not all at once. Nobody could explain it yet. A woman walking to the wash place below Amos's fields saw that the low ground there was still dark and wet when everything around it was gray, and she stood and looked at it and didn't say anything for a long time. One farmer, riding past at dawn, caught the glint of water moving in a channel along the ridge, and he pulled up and looked, and couldn't reconcile what he was seeing with the rest of the hollow he had just ridden through. A child sent to find a spring came back and said, the way children do, that the ditch was still running, and the adults didn't answer because they didn't yet know what to say, and saying nothing was easier than saying what it meant. That ditch was still running, and the reason it was still running was the reason Amos had spent 4 years betting on. He had bet everything on that spring, the high spring at the head of Raven Branch, fed by the snow the north slope held and the cool timber over the rock, hadn't failed because it had never failed, and the 4 years of laughter had been 4 years of a man preparing for exactly this. Water walked down the contour he had cut, along the stone he had laid, to the bottomland the hollow had laughed at him for watering, and his corn was green there, and his garden was alive, and the rest of Cane Bottom was dying around it. The realization didn't arrive in a single moment, because realizations like that never do, but it arrived the way the drought had, slow, and then all at once, and it changed the shape of everything that was going to happen next. The first men came up the line to ask before July was out, and they came the way men do when pride is fighting need, with their hats in their hands and their eyes on the ground. The man they had laughed at was the man they needed. They were the same men who had stood at the store and laughed at the fool's ditch. And now they were standing at the spill where the water reached Amos's fields, asking for a share of what they had spent 4 years calling a joke. Power in the hollow had inverted in a single season, and the man at the center of it hadn't moved an inch, because he was still gaunt, still silent, still working his bottomland, and the only thing that had changed was that he had been right, and the valley hadn't. Now the valley needed him, and the needing was the thing that would test both of them. Amos hadn't built the ditch to be right, and he hadn't built it to be owed, and the way the story came down, that mattered more than anything else in the telling. Everyone could see it now. He had built it because he had lived through a dry summer in his youth, when the bottomland corn died, and a kinsman lost his stock, and the hollow carried water from 2 ridges over until even that spring failed. And the memory of it had driven him to spend 4 years being laughed at, rather than risk living through it again. He wasn't a prophet, and he wasn't a genius, only a man with a long memory, and the patience to act on it. And the drought hadn't made him wise so much as it had revealed that he had been wise all along. There's a difference between being lucky and being right, and the ditch was the difference. And now everyone in Cane Bottom could see it, whether they wanted to or not. Asking didn't stay polite for long, because need has a way of curdling when it has to keep asking. And the second week was harder than the first. Pride was giving way to need. The same men who came hat in hand on the first day came back less politely on the third. And the fourth day brought men who hadn't come at all before, because their own springs had finally given out, and they had nowhere else to go. The ringleader who had mocked Amos loudest was now the most desperate, because his bottomland was the driest and his stock was the closest to gone. And desperation in a proud man has a way of coming out as anger instead of gratitude. Harlan Sisk had spent 4 years turning the fool's ditch into a public joke, and now the only water in the hollow ran through a man he had publicly humiliated. And there was no version of that which sat easy on him. Laughter had been cheap when the rain was free, and it was very expensive now. And the cost was being collected in the currency of pride. The asking got harder every week. A man who has mocked his neighbor for 4 years can't easily go and stand at that neighbor's ditch and ask for water. And the harder the drought bit, the harder the asking became. And some of the men in the hollow were beginning to wonder whether asking was going to be enough. The law of the time, and the custom of the mountains, would have broadly supported Amos if he had decided to keep the water for his own ground and post himself at the head gate with a rifle to make sure of it. Because a man's ditch and a man's water were his to defend. There were men across the country in those years who did exactly that. And the history of dry places is largely the history of that decision, and Cane Bottom was closer to making its own version of that history than anyone in it wanted to admit. What Amos was going to do with the only water in the valley was the question the rest of the summer turned on, and he hadn't said. And his not saying was its own kind of pressure on the hollow. One man's decision held the rest of the summer. He stood at the spill and watched the water spread across his green fields. And the men who had gathered at the lower end of the ditch watched him watch it. And the waiting was its own kind of drought, a dryness of not knowing. The hollow had spent 4 years telling him who he was, and now he was about to tell the hollow who he was. And the telling would happen in what he did with the water, and not in anything he said. The men at the ditch went home that night without an answer, and the water kept running, and the question kept sitting where he had left it, unanswered, in the green field at the upper end of the hollow. The trouble came to a head on a night in late July, and it came the way water trouble always comes, in the dark and at the head gate. Someone went for the head gate that night. Someone went up the ridge to Amos's split oak head gate on Raven Branch and tried to dam the take and cut a new channel toward the lower bottomland, where Harlan Sisk's ground was burning. The work was clumsy, done fast and by lantern, and the smell of fresh turned earth and split wood was still in the air when Amos found it at first light, standing at the head gate and looking at the gouge in the hillside and the marks of the shovel. He understood exactly what it meant, and exactly who it meant, because there was only one man in the hollow desperate enough and proud enough to try to take the water instead of asking for it. He didn't go down the hollow shouting, because Amos wasn't a man who shouted, and shouting wouldn't have fixed the head gate. What they had tried to break, he rebuilt. He repaired the take, set the timbers back, and packed the clay, working in the early light with the care of a man who had spent 4 years building the thing someone had just tried to break in a night. Then he waited to see what the man who did it would do when he saw his work undone, because the next move wasn't his, and he knew it, and the hollow knew it, and the man who had made the first move knew it too. The records of water fights in the dry years are full of this exact turn: headgates broken and rebuilt and broken again, hatchets taken to the works and pitchforks turned to weapons, one farmer even setting a beehive on his headgate so nobody would dare touch it. And Cane Bottom was one bad night away from joining that record. Harlan came up the line the next morning, and the way the story was told, he didn't come to apologize, because apologizing would have required him to admit what he had done and what he had been. Pride and desperation stood at the same headgate. He came to demand, with the desperation of a man watching his stock die, and the pride of a man who couldn't bring himself to beg from someone he had wronged for 4 years, and the two of them stood at the headgate while the water moved past them and the hollow held its breath below. Men who had gathered at the lower end of the ditch were watching to see whether Vindication was going to become violence, and they weren't sure which way it would go, because they knew Harlan and they knew Amos. And they knew what 4 years of mockery costs a man even when he doesn't show it. The ditch ran between them like a third person in the argument, indifferent to both, doing the only thing it knew how to do, which was carry the water down the hill. Cane Bottom teetered on the edge of the kind of fight that sends a place into the court records, or into worse, and the man with the right to start it was the one who had been wronged. The choice between a fight and a summer was his. Amos could have guarded the ditch and kept his water and let the valley take its chances, and no one in those mountains would have called him wrong for it, because the custom of the country would have backed him, and so would most of the men watching. He had every reason to make the men who laughed at him come and kneel for what they needed, and the only thing standing between him and that revenge was whatever it was in him that had made him dig the ditch in the first place. That same quiet patience the hollow had mistaken for madness was about to be the thing that decided whether Cane Bottom had a fight or a summer, and the choice was his alone. He opened the ditch, and the way the story came down, the opening was the whole point of the telling, and it was quieter than anyone expected. No one was asked to call it what it was. Amos didn't gloat, and he didn't make the men who mocked him crawl, and he didn't hold a sermon over them about who had been right and who had been wrong, because a man who has been right for 4 years doesn't need to say it out loud once the proof is running down the hill. He set the headgate to a fair flow, worked out a rotation with the families so each took their turn at the spill, and let the water that had cost him 4 years of ridicule carry the hollow through the worst summer anyone alive could remember. The Fool's Ditch became, without anyone renaming it, the ditch that saved the valley, and the man who built it never asked anyone to say so, and never needed to. Reversal was complete, and it was quiet, and that was the part the old-timers said was worth the telling, because a loud revenge is easy and a quiet generosity isn't. Generosity without an audience is the kind people remember. Men who had called it the Fool's Ditch ended up calling it the ditch that saved the valley, and they did it without Amos standing over them, because the water had done the arguing and the water didn't need a witness. Vindication without revenge turned out to be harder and more interesting than revenge, and the hollow remembered it longer for that, the way people remember the things they can't quite explain and don't quite deserve. The land had been telling the truth all along to anyone patient enough to read it, and the confident majority had been the ones who were wrong, and the proof of it ran down the ridge every morning and watered their children's gardens, and the man who had made it run asked for nothing back except the rotation he had already set. The ditch outlasted the laughter, and the men who made it. Long after Amos was gone, the water from Raven Branch still walked the contour he cut, to a bottomland that stayed green when the dry years came back. The mountains keep these stories because the mountains need them. If you want more of what the hollows kept quiet, subscribe, and pass this to someone told their idea was foolish.